The morning air carried the faint, sweet scent of damp earth as the first rays of sunlight slid through the narrow leaded glass window, breaking into a scatter of gold across the rough-hewn table in the corner, and you found yourself waking slowly, your body still wrapped in the heaviness of unfamiliar wool blankets, the sound of distant bells rolling in from the village square like a soft summons, as if the day itself had been rung into being by the church tower's steady voice, and you sat up, feeling the coarse linen of the undershirt brush against your skin, realizing that the world around you was one where every texture, every smell, and every sound belonged to a time before electricity and carriages, a time when the rhythm of life was measured not by clocks, but by sun and prayer. You rose carefully, your bare feet finding the chill of worn wooden planks beneath you, and you took in the modest room. A heavy oak chest with iron hinges sat closed against the wall. A clay pitcher and basin rested on a small stand for washing, and beside the hearth lay the blackened remains of last night's fire, still giving off a faint heat that clung to the air like an afterthought. And when you opened the small door and stepped outside, the village lay stretched before you, half in shadow, half in light, its low-roofed cottages leaning together as though huddled against the wind, their walls a patchwork of wattle and daub, and the air was alive with the quiet hum of early morning activity, the muffled lowing of cattle from the byre, and the soft murmur of women drawing water from the communal well. The people moved with a kind of unhurried purpose, each knowing their place in the day's unfolding. And as you wandered toward the square, your eyes caught the flutter of a bright red ribbon tied into the braid of a young woman carrying a basket of fresh eggs, and though her gaze did not meet yours, the faintest curve of her lips suggested a smile she had not yet decided to share, for in this world, glances and gestures were a language all their own, and courtship was not a matter of words spoken quickly, but of moments carefully built over time. The brief exchange at a market stall, the passing of a cup at a feast, the way a hand might brush another when placing bread upon a table. You soon learned that this was the feast day of St. Agnes, a time when young men and women were permitted to mingle more freely than on ordinary days, and the square was slowly transforming into a place of color and song, merchants arranging bolts of dyed cloth and strings of polished beads, minstrels tuning lutes beneath the shade of the great elm, the scent of spiced honey cakes beginning to mingle with the sharper tints of roasting meat. And though the festivities were still hours from their height, there was already a charge in the air, a subtle awareness that in the dance of the day, meetings might occur that would ripple through families and fortunes for years to come. As you watched, an older woman in a finely woven cloak moved among the younger women, her eyes keen and calculating, speaking softly to each in turn, as if weighing their worth in some private ledger, and beside her trailed a boy, carrying a ledger, quite literally, making small marks as she nodded. This was the village matchmaker, a figure as respected as the priest, and as feared as a magistrate, for she held in her mind the tangled web of bloodlines, dowries, and alliances, and in her hands the power to decide who might spend their winters together, and who would be left to the solitude of a single bed. In the midst of this, you caught sight of a young man in a green wool tunic standing near the fountain, his arms crossed but his eyes restless, moving constantly toward the street where the ribbon-haired girl had gone. And it was in the small tightening of his jaw and the faint lift of his shoulders that you recognized something universal. The quiet anticipation of seeing someone not yet yours, but not quite a stranger either, and you realized that in this time, as in any other, the heart found ways to speak long before the mouth ever dared to. You lingered there, the bells striking another hour above, though here the sound was less a marker of time than an anchor, holding the day in place while people moved through their rituals, their glances, their whispered words, and you began to feel that if you stood still long enough, you might witness a story unfolding in real time, a story not of kings or battles, but of a ribbon, a green tunic, and the silent crossing of a square that could alter to lives forever. The market square had begun to fill with more voices now, each conversation blending into a warm, indistinct hum that wrapped itself around the air like a blanket. And you could see that the stone fountain at its center had become a kind of gathering point where villagers paused between errands, leaning on its worn edge as if hoping to catch sight of someone they might not admit they were waiting for. And there, beneath the shifting shadow of the elm, the young man in the green wool tunic still stood, though his posture had softened, his arms no longer crossed but resting loosely at his sides, his gaze sweeping the crowd as if trying to locate one particular thread in a tapestry that was becoming more complex with every passing minute. It was then that the ribbon-haired girl returned her basket, now lighter, and her steps unhurried, weaving between two stalls, where an old man sold beeswax candles and a pair of children tried to hide a stolen apple behind their backs. And though she did not look directly at him, you could see the way her path curved ever so slightly, the way her pace slowed as she drew nearer, as though the very air between them was conspiring to close the distance without anyone daring to acknowledge it. And when she passed by, her sleeve brushed the back of his hand, whether by accident or design, you could not tell, and for the briefest moment, his fingers shifted as if tempted to hold the contact. But instead he drew in a slow breath and turned toward the fountain, his expression unreadable, but his eyes brighter than they had been a moment before. Around them, the square continued to pulse with small exchanges of this kind, women standing by the fishmonger's stall pretending to examine the scales while keeping an ear open for a familiar voice, men lingering longer than necessary at the cooper's workshop because they knew a certain pair of eyes might pass that way, and always the matchmaker moving among them, her cloak brushing against skirts and boots as she whispered names, dates, and dowry sums to those who had the right to know her presence. A reminder that affection in this world was never entirely a private affair, for it was bound by the expectations of family, the weight of alliances, and the quiet but unshakable hand of the church. Near the edge of the square, a group of young men gathered around a traveling minstrel, who had begun to sing a ballad of courtly love, his voice clear and sure as he told of a knight who had served 7 years in silence for the sake of a lady's favor. And though the song was exaggerated for the sake of drama, its themes were not unfamiliar to those listening, for here patience was considered not just a virtue but a necessity. Courtship could be a matter of seasons, sometimes even years, and every glance, every word, every shared task was a step in a long dance where misstep could mean gossip, and gossip could mean ruin. You followed the ribbon-haired girl as she moved toward a booth where a merchant sold lengths of fine linen and dyed wool, the kind reserved for festival garments and wedding gowns, and you noticed how her fingers lingered on a bolt of soft blue fabric, her eyes darting once toward the green tunic boy who, though pretending to speak to another man about the price of salted pork, seemed entirely aware of her presence. And you realized you were watching the earliest stage of something fragile but deliberate, the shaping of a connection that might one day be spoken of over winter fires, its details softened by memory but its essence preserved. Somewhere behind you, the matchmaker's voice rose briefly above the murmur as she announced that the first of the afternoon dances would take place after the church bells rang again. And already groups of young people were making their way toward the open space beside the fountain where the musicians were gathering, the thrum of a drum and the pluck of a lute drifting into the cool air. And as you stood there, you felt the energy in the square shift again, not hurried, not chaotic, but alive, as though the entire village was leaning forward into the next moment, waiting to see who would choose whom and what silent promises might be made before the day was done. The bells began to ring, deep and resonant, their sound carrying over the rooftops and cobblestone lanes, calling not only the faithful to the church but the curious to the open space beside the fountain, where musicians now tuned their instruments, the lute strings humming like warm threads of anticipation, while a small drumbeat began to pulse in time with the shifting crowd. And slowly the market's hum transformed into something more focused, the mingling of voices becoming lighter, quicker, as people adjusted cloaks, smoothed tunics, and tried not to look too eager for what was about to happen. At the edge of the forming circle, the boy in the green tunic stood a little apart from his friends, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on the musicians but glancing every so often toward the linen stall where the ribbon-haired girl still lingered, pretending to study a spool of embroidery, a thread while her fingers wound and unwound the same piece of string as though it were a charm against shyness. And though no words passed between them, their movements seemed to mirror each other. He shifting his weight, she tilting her head, he brushing dust from his sleeve, she tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, small gestures that in this setting were as deliberate as spoken invitations. When the first dance began, It was not the kind where couples paired off immediately, but a weaving circle of alternating men and women, hands linked and steps measured, the pattern drawing strangers into brief but close contact, each turn of the circle bringing new partners, new glances, new chances for the shy and the bold alike. And as the dancers moved, you could see how the village used such moments here. In the spinning of the circle, a boy might feel the press of a girl's hand and wonder if the pressure lingered an instant too long. A girl might notice whether her partner's gaze dipped respectfully or boldly lingered, and all the while the elders watched from the sidelines, seeing not just the steps but the undercurrents, the way laughter came quickly or hesitantly, the way shoulders leaned closer or stayed politely apart. The ribbon-haired girl joined the circle at the urging of two friends, her cheeks faintly flushed as she took her place between a stout baker's apprentice and a young man from a neighboring village, whose fine boots drew more than a few approving glances. Yet it was when the green tunic boy entered the opposite side of the circle that her smile seemed to settle into something steadier, for though the steps kept them apart for most of the dance, each turn of the pattern brought them closer, until finally their hands met just for a heartbeat. The warm clasp, a brief spark hidden in the open air, and then they passed, the circle pulling them away again, leaving each to wonder if the other had felt it as clearly as they had. Around them, the rest of the village seemed to bask in the familiar rhythm of such afternoons where courtship was as much about public ritual as private feeling, for here romance unfolded in plain sight, guarded by tradition, yet quietly shaped by personal choice. And as the music swelled into the second round of dancing, the boy's friends clapped him on the shoulder, the girl's companions whispered something that made her laugh softly, and you could sense that both of them now knew the next step in this slow, deliberate dance would have to be taken outside the circle somewhere, between the eyes of the crowd and the privacy of a shadowed lane where words could be spoken more freely. The matchmaker moving along the edges of the dancers had already taken notice, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and though she did not yet approach either of them, you could see the way she filed the moment away, storing it alongside the day's other quiet revelations, for in a place like this nothing bloomed in complete secrecy, and every seed of affection had many unseen gardeners. When the music finally slowed, giving way to the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of skirts as dancers drifted toward the fountain for a sip of cool water, the boy in the green tunic found himself standing once more at the edge of the gathering, close enough to see the ribbon-haired girl talking to her friends, yet far enough that it would not seem forward if he lingered, and though he felt the urge to step toward her, he hesitated, knowing that in a village like this too much eagerness could be as noticeable as too much distance, and so he waited, pretending to watch the children tossing pebbles into the shallow water, while keeping her in the corner of his vision. The girl, for her part, was engaged in a careful balance of attention, laughing with her companions, leaning in to hear a whispered comment, but every so often glancing just beyond them, her gaze settling for a heartbeat on the boy before she looked away again. A pattern as old as the cobblestones beneath their feet, the unspoken exchange of two people measuring not only their own courage, but the openness of the moment, aware that any step forward would be noted by half the market and recounted by the other half before the day was out. It was at this delicate point that the matchmaker approached, her smile warm but her eyes sharp, the kind of look that seemed to peel away hesitation and see straight to intention, and she greeted the girl first, speaking of the fine weather and the good turnout for the dance before shifting seamlessly to more personal topics, asking after her family, her embroidery work, and, with a subtle tilt of the head, whether she had noticed how well certain young men carried themselves in the circle today. A question that was not really a question but an opening, and though the girl only gave a modest shrug, the faint deepening of her blush was enough to confirm the matchmaker's suspicions. The boy was intercepted in much the same way moments later, though with a slightly different approach, for the matchmaker knew that men could be coaxed by pride as much as by curiosity, and so she spoke first of his skill in the dance, of how his steps had kept perfect time, of how his hands were steady in the turns, and then, as if in passing, she mentioned that the girl with the ribbon had seemed to enjoy herself, a statement that left the boy uncertain whether she meant in general or in reference to him specifically, but which nonetheless planted the seed of possibility more firmly than before. All around them the market began to return to its usual flow, merchants calling out prices, children darting between stalls, the church bells marking the hour with slow resonant notes. Yet for the boy and the girl the day's pace had subtly changed the air, carrying not just the smell of baked bread and fresh herbs, but the charged quiet of an unspoken agreement. Each knew that they would cross paths again before the sunset, though neither could say exactly how or where, trusting instead in the natural weaving of the village's life to draw them into one another's path once more. As the matchmaker moved on to speak with other villagers, her presence was like the faint ripple left in a pond after a stone has sunk, seemingly gone, but still spreading her quiet encouragement, altering the course of the afternoon in ways not immediately visible. And though the boy and the girl both returned to their own corners of the market, the story of their meeting had already begun to take shape, carried not only by their own thoughts, but by the knowing eyes of those who had seen them dance. Later that afternoon, when the sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows between the timber-framed houses, the boy found himself sent on an errand by his mother, who needed a length of dyed wool from the weaver at the far end of the lane. And though it was a task he had done many times before, today he took the route past the fountain, moving at a pace that was neither hurried nor aimless, as if he was simply going about his business, while secretly hoping that fate might arrange for a certain ribbon-haired girl to be somewhere along his way. He did not have to wander long, for near the cooper's shop, where the scent of freshly worked oak mingled with the tang of pitch, he spotted her leaning over a stall of carved combs, her fingers brushing the smooth wood as she considered one shaped like a vine, and for a moment he almost walked past, telling himself it would be foolish to stop without reason. But then he thought of the matchmaker's words and of how rare such a chance might be, and so he slowed, offering a polite greeting that made her glance up with a small smile, the kind that was cautious yet not closed. The conversation that followed was brief, no more than a few sentences about the fine craftsmanship of the combs, and how the market had been livelier than usual that morning, but it was the way she lingered a fraction longer after her reply, and the way her eyes didn't dart away too quickly, that told him he had not been unwelcome. And when she finally turned back to the stall, he walked on with the faint sense that something had shifted, that they had moved from the uncertain distance of strangers toward the fragile beginning of acquaintance. In the weeks that followed, their encounters became a quiet pattern, never arranged but never entirely by chance, sometimes in the market, sometimes at the churchyard after Mass, once by the river where villagers came to wash clothes in the clear current, and each time there was a little more to say, a little more to share. Snippets about the weather, the progress of the harvest, a passing joke about the miller's donkey that had wandered into the baker's doorway, and though none of these were declarations, each was a small stone laid in the foundation of something that could grow. What neither of them could ignore, however, was that in a village this size, such moments never went unnoticed, and soon there were murmurs, quiet ones at first, exchanged between older women as they shelled peas on their doorsteps, then more open comments from friends, half teasing and half approving, and while these whispers could be flattering, they also carried weight, for in medieval life a courtship was rarely only between two people. It was woven into the entire fabric of the community, where families, neighbors, and even employers all had a stake in whether a match would succeed. The matchmaker, ever watchful, began to appear more often in their orbit, sometimes offering the boy a suggestion about a gift that might please a young woman without seeming to forward, sometimes hinting to the girl about the kind of qualities that made for a reliable husband. And though she never pressed them, her presence acted as a steady hand guiding a barge along a slow, winding river, ensuring that their course was toward one another and not away. One crisp morning, when the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, the boy decided to take her advice and bring a small token to the girl. Not flowers, for those would wilt quickly, and not sweets, which were rare and costly, but a fine ribbon dyed a deep warm red, the kind that would last for years and could be worn on feast days. And when he offered it to her in the square, the look of surprise on her face was matched only by the softening of her voice as she thanked him, her fingers lingering on the fabric, as though she were already imagining how it might feel in her hair. That evening, as the bells from the church tower marked the hour of vespers and the sky took on the deep blue of approaching night, the girl sat by the small fire in her family's hall, her mother spinning wool beside her, while her younger brothers dozed in a heap near the hearth. And though she kept her hands busy mending a tear in her cloak, her mind drifted again and again to the ribbon tucked safely in the chest at her feet, the gift's color vivid in her memory against the muted tones of the day. And with each recollection she felt the faint, warm pulse of something both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. The boy, meanwhile, walked the narrow path from the smithy back to his own home, his boots scraping softly over the damp earth, his thoughts replaying the way she had smiled when accepting the ribbon, how her fingers had traced its edge for just a heartbeat too long before folding it neatly. And though he told himself not to read too much into such things, he could not help the quiet sense of triumph that crept into his chest, as though the small gesture had been more than just a kindness. It had been noticed, valued, and perhaps even cherished. Over the next few days, their meetings carried a new undercurrent, subtle but undeniable, and while they still spoke of simple matters, whether the carpenter's new apprentice was truly as skilled as the older men claimed, how the early frost might affect the winter stores, there were moments between words when their eyes met and neither spoke. A shared silence that was not awkward but rather a quiet thread binding them together, each aware of it and yet unwilling to pull it too tight too soon. By the feast of St. Martin, when the village gathered in the great hall to share roast goose, fresh bread, and mugs of ale, the girl wore the ribbon in her hair, tied just above her left ear so that it caught the light of the hearth fire, and though she never looked directly at him across the room, the boy noticed, and the knowledge that she had chosen this day when the entire community would see to it where it felt like an unspoken declaration, subtle but public in the way medieval courtship often was. Such signals mattered greatly in their world, for direct approaches could be frowned upon, especially in the early stages of a relationship, and instead couples relied on gestures, tokens, and the watchful eyes of others to carry meaning. A shared dance during a feast, a place saved on the church bench, or even a walk together to fetch water could be interpreted as steps toward betrothal. And everyone present that night seemed to understand that the ribbon was no mere ornament, it was a sign. The matchmaker, positioned near the head of the table, caught the boy's glance and gave the slightest nod, her approval subtle but unmistakable, and though neither she nor the boy's parents said anything outright, there was a sense that plans were quietly being set in motion, the kind of plans that moved slowly but inevitably toward a formal agreement, for in their time love might bloom in private, but marriage was a public matter, involving not just hearts but land, labor, and reputation. When the evening's revelry wound down and the guests began spilling into the cool night air, the boy found himself walking behind the girl and her family, close enough to hear her laughter as her father recounted some jest from the feast. And though he said nothing, he hoped, perhaps even prayed, that the path between them would keep narrowing in the days to come, until there would be no need for chance meetings at the market or cautious glances across the square, only the certainty of walking side by side. In the weeks following the feast of St. Martin, the air grew sharper and the first real snows began to cling stubbornly to the rooftops, turning the narrow lanes of the village into winding paths of white that crunched beneath boots. And though life carried on with the steady rhythm of winter wood to be chopped, animals to be fed, cloaks to be patched, the thread between the boy and the girl remained taut and unbroken, pulling them into each other's orbit with a quiet inevitability that neither dared speak aloud. The ribbon was still in her hair most days, though now it appeared in different ways, woven into a braid when she carried water from the well, knotted loosely at the back of her head when tending the geese, and, though she never admitted it, she always noticed, when his eyes caught on it for just a moment longer than was necessary, as though confirming it was still there, still his gift, still a part of her. Opportunities for conversation in the cold months were fewer, for the market stalls were sparse, and most folk preferred to hurry indoors, rather than linger in the wind. But winter in a medieval village also brought the communal gatherings of long evenings, spinning bees where women sat in a circle by the hearth, trading gossip while their hands worked the wool, and ale nights at the tavern where men warmed themselves in the company of neighbors, and on rare occasions, both groups shared the same space for music, games, and storytelling. And it was at one such evening that the boy found himself seated, just across the table from her, the firelight flickering across her face as she listened to an old man recount a tale of knights and quests. There was no touching, no whispering to many eyes for that, but every time the storyteller reached a dramatic moment and the room leaned forward to listen, they both glanced at each other in the hush, as though sharing the same thought, that such quests, though grand in song, were not the only adventures worth pursuing. By midwinter, whispers began circulating, not malicious, but curious among the villagers, older women noting how the girl's cheeks flushed brighter when his name was mentioned, the baker commenting on how the boy always seemed to appear near the well, just as she was there, the matchmaker, dropping hints to both families that perhaps the spring would bring more than the thaw. And while such talk could be dangerous if unfounded, in this case it worked like a gentle tide, nudging the two closer with each passing week. One late afternoon, when the snow had softened under a brief spell of sunshine, they met at the edge of the frozen stream where she was gathering branches for kindling. And though they spoke of simple things, the stubborn cold, the rumor of a traveling merchant arriving with spices, the way they lingered their boots, marking slow circles in the slush, made clear to both of them that something deeper was taking root, something that neither frost nor distance could easily kill. When they parted that day, each carrying their separate bundles back toward the glow of their own hearths, there was no promise made aloud, yet both carried the same certainty in their hearts, that when the snow melted and the fields turned green again, the world would not be as it had been before, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would no longer be two paths running parallel, but one road shared. The winter's hold loosened slowly, as it always did, first with the drip of meltwater from the thatched eaves, then with the softening of the earth underfoot, so that boots sank into mud instead of crunching over frost, and finally with the tentative bursts of green, pushing through the brown fields, announcing that the turning of the seasons was not just promised but happening before their very eyes. By the time the first true market day of spring arrived, the village square was alive again in a way it had not been for months. Merchants unfurled their awnings with a pride that matched the sun's return. Chickens squawked in wicker cages. Cloth merchants spread bolts of linen and wool dyed in colors brighter than anything winter had allowed, and musicians stood at corners with fiddles and drums, their songs weaving through the shouts of barter and laughter. He saw her before she saw him, her basket looped over one arm, her ribbon now a fresh shade of green to match the season, her face carrying that look of someone happy simply to be outside in the warmth again. Though he told himself he would approach casually, his feet betrayed him, pulling him toward her with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting for this moment since the last time the fields were bare. Their meeting was not the stuff of poetry. She was buying onions from a farmer and he stood beside her, pretending to be very interested in the same. But the exchange of smiles between them in that small, crowded space spoke volumes, the kind of look that could not be hidden, not from the farmer, not from the other customers, and certainly not from the matchmaker, who happened to be passing and stopped to take in the scene, with the satisfaction of someone whose quiet work was unfolding exactly as planned. After the purchase, they walked together through the market, speaking of everything and nothing, the new calves in the meadow, the chance of rain that afternoon, the arrival of a tinker selling curious little trinkets from far-off towns, and while such topics seemed ordinary to anyone listening, each moment of shared conversation was a brick laid on a road only they could see, leading somewhere neither dared name just yet. It was near the end of the market that they came upon the tinker's stall, a table crowded with brass pins, carved combs, small mirrors, framed in wood, and one odd little object, a pewter token, stamped with the image of a hawk worn smooth at the edges by years of handling, which he picked up and turned over in his hand, and without quite knowing why, he pressed it into her palm with a half smile, saying only, "For luck," as if that were explanation enough. Her fingers closed around it, and she did not let go even as they said their goodbyes at the edge of the square. And later that evening, when she sat by the fire in her family's cottage, she took it out again and turned it over in the light, the metal warm from her touch, and wondered not for the first time if luck had anything to do with the road that now seemed to be drawing them steadily together. The spring festival arrived with a kind of anticipation that seemed to charge the very air, as though every bird's song, every rush of wind through budding branches, and every creak of wagon wheels over the village road had been rehearsing for this day for weeks, and from the moment the sun began to rise, the lanes, filled with the shuffle and chatter of neighbors making their way toward the common green where the heart of the celebration always pulsed. Banners of deep red, gold, and green were strung from one oak to another, their colors snapping gently in the breeze like signals to anyone still in their doorway that they should come quickly, because the first fiddler had already struck a note and the bakers had laid out honeyed cakes so fresh the steam still curled from them. This year, the festival felt different to him, not because the musicians were livelier or the merchants more generous with their samples, but because somewhere in that crowd was the person who had been on his mind all through the thaw, the person who, without knowing it, had turned the turning of the seasons into something personal, something that seemed meant for the two of them alone. He found her near the maypole, her hair braided with ribbons to match the garlands wound around the pole's tall frame, her eyes catching the light the way the polished brass bells at her waist caught the sound of each step. And though there were dozens of others gathered, their children darting between legs, elders leaning on canes and trading stories, traders hawking sweet cider from clay jugs, it seemed for a moment that they were the only two people standing in the field. The dancing began with the same ancient rhythm as always, pairs taking hold of colored ribbons and circling the pole in patterns that wove in and out, over and under, until the whole thing was wrapped in a bright, spiraled skin. And when the call came for those unpartnered to join, he stepped forward with an ease he hadn't felt at the winter market, bowing slightly before offering her a ribbon and the space beside him in the winding line. Their hands brushed more than once as they moved, and each time it happened it felt almost deliberate, though neither of them made more of it than a quick glance and a smile. After all, courtship in a village was as much about what was unsaid as what was declared, and the little touches, the shared jokes, the moments of almost private laughter amid the noise, were as binding as any words could be. When the music paused for the midday feast, they found themselves side by side on the grass with a plate of roast lamb between them, tearing pieces from the bone and dipping them into the mustard pot, while they spoke of everything from the first planting of barley to the strange stories the traveling players had performed last year. It was the kind of conversation that roamed freely, needing no structure, because the company itself was the point. The afternoon brought contests, archery, sack races, tug-of-war, and though he joined the men pulling at the rope in the dust and she watched from the crowd, he noticed how her laughter rose above the cheers when his team finally won, and later she admitted she had been silently willing them to victory if only so she could see the boyish grin that now lingered on his face. As the sky began to shift into the rich golds and purples of early evening, the festival drums returned, slower now, inviting pairs to step forward for the final dances of the day. And though neither spoke the request aloud, they seemed to meet at the same moment at the edge of the crowd, moving toward each other in a way that made it impossible to tell who had begun it, only that it ended with their hands joined and their steps falling into a rhythm that felt older than either of them. When the last song ended and the crowd began to scatter into smaller knots heading home, they lingered in the soft dusk, speaking in the low tones people use when they are not ready for the day to end. And though he walked her as far as the lane that turned toward her family's farm, he stopped short of the gate, pressing her pewter hawk token into her hand again, as if to remind her that whatever roads they each walked tonight, they were already meeting in the same place in the days to come. Summer had come with that lazy, unhurried warmth that seemed to make every stone wall glow and every meadow hum, and in those months the village slowed its pace just enough that people could linger in doorways or along the edges of the fields without anyone questioning why, and he found that this slowing down brought him more chances than ever to see her without the bustle of a festival around them. The first of these meetings happened on a Tuesday, the sort of day when most folk were too busy with the hay harvest to wander far, and yet there she was, standing at the bend of the brook, where the water ran over flat stones and threw back the sky in silver ripples, her skirts tucked just high enough to keep them from the spray, her hands full of wild mint she'd been gathering for her mother's brewing, and when she looked up, The sunlight caught her hair in a way that made the green of the leaves behind her seem even deeper. He joined her without asking if he might, crouching to run his hands through the cool water, and they spoke of small things at first, the stubbornness of the goats, the way the carpenter's new shutters had been carved with a pattern of ivy leaves, but soon they found themselves talking about the midsummer feast that would come in a fortnight, and how the bonfires lit along the ridge could be seen for miles. In medieval villages, courtship often unfolded in such quiet encounters, away from watchful parents and gossiping neighbors, and yet never truly alone, for there was always the hum of the world around them, the thrum of bees in the clover, the crack of a far-off axe in the wood, the lowing of cattle in the next field, and it was in this shared space between solitude and community that trust began to grow. By the time the midsummer night arrived, the air was so warm that no one bothered with heavy cloaks, and the green at the village center was ringed with torches and benches for the music and storytelling that would go on until the moon dipped low. And though there were games and dances aplenty, it was the long walk home afterward that seemed to matter most. He had offered, as custom allowed, to see her safely back to her father's land, and she had accepted with a nod that was almost shy, but not uncertain, and they set out along the cart track with the torchlight behind them and the faint glow of the bonfires still flickering on the ridge in front of them. In those days, such walks were not just a courtesy, but a part of the slow dance of courtship, an unspoken chance to measure how icily words came, how comfortable silence felt, how one adjusted their stride to match the other's, and, as they moved, they traded bits of memory like beads on a string. The first time each had seen snow deep enough to bury the hedges. The summer a traveling peddler had sold them spun sugar that stuck to their fingers. The year the mill wheel froze so hard it cracked. When they reached the gate, they stood for a moment as if waiting for something more to happen. The glow of the nearest torch only just catching their faces, and it was then he produced a sprig of rosemary from his pocket, a token not as costly as silver or pewter, but one that in those times carried a clear meaning of remembrance and affection, and pressed it into her palm before stepping back into the night. The next weeks were marked by more such meetings. Once in the orchard when the first apples were just beginning to blush, another time in the churchyard after Mass, where they lingered over talk of the stained glass window depicting St. George, both knowing that others might pass and see them, but content with the publicness of it, for such was the way things moved forward in their world. By late summer they had settled into a pattern that everyone in the village noticed, though few commented on directly. She would bring an extra cake to the market, setting it on his bench without a word. He would offer to carry her basket home, and in this rhythm of giving and receiving, they wove something as certain as any betrothal, yet without the formal declaration, letting the season carry them toward whatever came next. Autumn came quietly, but with a kind of certainty that made the air feel heavier, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from the first hearth fires of the season, and the fields turned gold beneath a sky that seemed bluer than in summer, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath before the long sleep of winter. And with the harvest came a shift in the way people moved through the days, for work was abundant. But so was the gathering of neighbors, and in such gatherings there was always room for the subtle weaving of glances and words that made courtship possible. It was in the thick of the apple harvest that he saw her again, standing on the low rung of a ladder with her apron full of fruit, her sleeves rolled back to the elbow, her cheeks flushed from the crisp air and the weight of the work, and she laughed as a breeze sent a swirl of leaves tumbling past them, the sound so light that even the crows in the hedgerows seemed to pause to listen. He offered to carry her basket to the cider press, and though her father was nearby speaking with the reeve about the yield and the weather, there was no objection, for in those times the tasks of harvest were often the one excuse young folk had to walk side by side without raising suspicion. And so they set off down the worn track, the sunlight falling in patches through the branches above. They spoke of the coming Michaelmas fair, of the minstrels who might pass through, of the rumors that a merchant from the city would bring dyed cloth in colors not seen in the village for years. And though the words were about ordinary things, the ease between them made each step feel shorter, and the moments when their hands brushed on the basket handle left a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun, At the cider press, the air was thick with the scent of crushed apples, and the rhythmic creak of the wooden screw filled the space between the chatter of those working, and for a brief moment, as she leaned close to hand him another apple, their shoulders touched and neither moved away, though they both knew others might see, for in the openness of harvest such small signs could be explained away as accident, yet carried meaning for those involved. When the day's work was done, the custom was to share a simple meal in the barn, with bread still warm from the oven, cheese wrapped in cloth, and jugs of fresh cider passed along the long trestle tables. And here the older women kept a watchful eye, though they often pretended not to notice if a lad and a maid found themselves sitting close enough for elbows to touch, so long as the talk stayed modest and the laughter light. Later, as the light faded and lanterns were lit, there came the traditional harvest walk, when small groups would wander the boundary paths to mark the end of the day, and it was here away from the crowded barn that he and she found themselves falling behind the others, the sound of footsteps and voices growing faint, until it was only the two of them, the moon just rising over the hedgerow, silvering the tops of the uncut grass. They talked then not just of fairs and feasts, but of winters past, the one when the snow had come so heavy that the church door had to be dug out, the winter the river froze hard enough for children to play upon, and in the telling of these shared memories, they found a sense of belonging that stretched beyond the moment, as though their lives had already begun to braid together. When they reached the village again, the others were already dispersing, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the dusk, and before she stepped through her gate, she slipped something into his hand, a small, smooth chestnut, polished by her thumb, a token with no value but the meaning they both understood, and he closed his fingers around it as though it were a coin of gold. In medieval villages, such tokens often served as unspoken promises, small enough to hide but strong enough to hold in memory through the turning of seasons. And as he walked home, the chestnut warm in his palm, he knew that the coming winter would not feel nearly so long. Winter crept into the village, not with a sudden snowstorm, but with a steady shortening of days, the light slipping away earlier each afternoon until the evening seemed to arrive before the work was done, and the cold came in layers. First in the crisp mornings that made one's breath hang in the air, then in the frosted edges of thatch and hedgerow, and finally in the deep bite of wind that could turn fingers numb within minutes. Yet for all its hardships, winter in a medieval village was also a time when courtship found new, quieter forms, for the fields lay still and the people were drawn indoors, where warmth and candlelight offered spaces for conversations that could not have happened under the open sky of summer. With the harvest long stored away in barns and granaries, the rhythm of the village changed. And so too did the ways in which young men and women saw one another, for now they met less in the wide fields and more in the intimacy of shared indoor tasks, mending nets, carding wool, or tending to the drying herbs hung from rafters. And these moments, though seemingly ordinary, allowed for glances and words that might have gone unnoticed by watchful elders busy with their own work. It was during the preparations for the Advent feast that he saw her again, this time in the church itself, kneeling with the other women to lay evergreen boughs along the windowsills, their resin scent filling the cold air, her head bowed as she worked, the candlelight catching in the loose strands of hair that had slipped from beneath her veil. And when she looked up, their eyes met across the narrow aisle, and for a moment it was as if the choir-est soft humming behind them was meant only for the two of them. The church in winter became not just a place of worship, but one of the few spaces where the entire village gathered regularly, and though it was not a place for frivolous talk, the simple act of standing side by side during Mass, of passing the peace with a touch of hands, carried more weight than any lengthy conversation could, for in a world where public affection was rare, such brief contact was treasured. After the service, the younger villagers would often linger just outside the church doors, pretending to discuss the sermon or the weather while waiting for the older folk to begin their slow walk home. And it was in this interval that quiet arrangements could be made, plans to help repair a fence, to carry firewood from the forest, to visit an elder who needed aid, and each of these errands offered a reason to spend time together without inviting suspicion. One such occasion came when the village miller's wife fell ill, and she was asked to help tend the household, for there was bread to be baked and grain to be sorted, and he, knowing that the mill's wheel needed clearing of ice, volunteered his assistance, thus finding himself working in the same place for nearly a whole day. The two of them moving between the mill's cold, damp floor and the warm kitchen where the fire snapped and hissed, each task bringing another chance to speak in low voices over the noise of grinding stone or the clatter of wooden bowls. By the time the Yule log was lit in the great hall for the midwinter feast, their connection had deepened into something both of them felt, but neither had spoken aloud, for in medieval custom, courtship was often a slow weaving of trust and shared labor rather than sudden declarations, and the feasts themselves, though filled with laughter, music, and dancing, were also watched closely by family and neighbors alike. That night, as the hall filled with the smell of spiced ale and roasting meats, the minstrels struck up a lively tune, and groups of dancers formed in the center, the steps simple enough for everyone to join, and it was here, in the circle of hands and feet moving to the rhythm, that he finally felt her fingers in his, warm despite the chill in the air, her eyes meeting his in the brief moments when they passed face to face. And though the touch was fleeting, it spoke more clearly than any words could. When the dance ended and the torches burned low, the guests began to drift away, their laughter trailing into the cold night, and outside, under the hard glitter of winter stars, he walked her to her father's door, speaking only of the frost on the hedges and the promise of snow. Yet as they parted, she paused and said softly that the millstones would need tending again before the thaw. And he understood that this was not just about the work. In the days that followed, the snow did come, blanketing the village in silence, and though travel became harder, the paths between their homes remained well-trodden, for even in the harshest months, the business of living and of quietly building something more than friendship could not be stopped by the weather. And so their story moved on, shaped by the slow turning of the seasons and the customs that allowed love to grow in small, steady steps. The snow began to soften under the lengthening days, dripping from the eaves in slow, steady beads that caught the sunlight, before falling to the ground, and with each drop the world seemed to stretch itself awake from winter's long sleep, the river loosening its icy grip, the fields revealing the pale green shoots of the first brave plants, and the village stirring with talk of the coming spring fair, which for many was not merely a market for goods but an occasion for new bonds to be formed. For in the medieval year there were few events that allowed such freedom for the young to mingle without the close eye of family. As the thaw deepened, the paths between cottages became muddy ribbons, but this did little to dampen spirits, for the fair promised the arrival of traders from neighboring towns, the music of traveling minstrels, the bright colors of cloth and ribbon laid out on wooden stalls, and for the young men and women, it brought the hope of walking together among the bustle without the need for excuses, their conversations disguised by the noise of bargaining and the calls of merchants. For him, the weeks before the fair were filled with quiet anticipation, and he found himself working longer hours at the mill, perhaps to earn enough to buy a token worthy of giving, for in those days a gift was not merely a gesture, but a language of its own. A ribbon might mean admiration, a pair of gloves could signify warmth and care, and a length of fine cloth, though costly, might speak of a desire for a future together. Yet all of these offerings were given with careful timing, for a misstep could invite gossip or even disapproval from watchful parents. She, too, seemed to move through those days with an unspoken awareness, her errands bringing her more often past the mill where he worked, her smile lingering just a moment longer than politeness required. And sometimes, when the cold air bit less sharply, they would walk a short way together, speaking of the coming season's planting, of the lambs soon to be born, and of the traveling troupe of musicians who were said to be headed for the fair. When the day of the spring fair finally arrived, the village green was transformed into a tapestry of color and sound, stalls draped in dyed wool and linen, tables heavy with pies, honeyed cakes, and roasted meats, the air thick with the mingled scents of spiced cider and woods, and at the heart of it all, the laughter and music that made the day feel like a break from the long, orderly pace of rural life. For here people mingled freely, weaving in and out of the crowd with baskets and mugs in hand. We found her near the stall of a ribbon seller, her fingers tracing over the bright strips of cloth deep blue, pale green, crimson and, When he stepped beside her, he did not speak right away, only watched as she tested the smoothness between her fingers, and then, without ceremony, he handed the merchant a coin and took the ribbon she had been holding, pressing it into her hand with the quiet explanation that it would suit her hair. The words, simple, but in their world, full of meaning. The ribbon, once tied in her hair, became more than a decoration. It was a visible sign of his attention, and though others might notice and whisper, the fair was a place where such things could pass as harmless tokens, for the dancing that would come later gave opportunity for partners to be chosen in plain sight. And when the musicians began to play in the open space before the green, he offered her his hand. The two of them stepping into the circle of dancers with smiles they could not quite hide. The steps of the dance were simple: forward, turn, back again, and each time their hands touched, it was as though the months of quiet glances, of shared work and small conversations, had built to this moment when they could stand together without pretense, the music wrapping around them like a promise. And when the dance ended, they did not part immediately, but walked together toward the edge of the green where the crowd thinned and the late sun painted everything in gold. There, away from most eyes, he spoke more plainly than he had before, telling her that he wished to speak with her father when the time was right, to see if they might begin the formal steps toward betrothal. And though her answer was given with the modesty expected of a young woman in her place, there was no mistaking the warmth in her voice when she said she would welcome such a conversation, though it must come after the planting season when her family's work would allow time for such matters. As they returned to the heart of the fair, the musicians striking up another tune and the merchants calling out their last bargains before dusk, there was a new ease between them, for the understanding had been spoken, and in the slow rhythm of their world, this was no small thing. It was the turning of a page, the beginning of a new chapter, shaped not by the rush of passion alone, but by the deliberate, steady weaving of two lives within the fabric of the village. The days after the fair seemed to pass with a different kind of weight, for though the work of spring demanded long hours, ploughing the fields, mending fences, tending to the new lambs, there was a quiet certainty in their shared glances, an unspoken understanding that something had shifted. And though nothing outwardly had yet been arranged, both knew that the next steps would bring their lives into closer and more permanent alignment. For in their world, affection without the intent of formal betrothal would not long be tolerated. It was his task now to prepare himself for the approach to her father, and this was not a matter to be undertaken lightly, for in the medieval village, a marriage was as much a binding of families as it was of individuals, and a young man's worth was measured not only by his own industriousness but by the stability of his kin, the land they held, the reputation they carried, and the respect they commanded among neighbors. And so he spent these days in diligent labor, knowing that idle hands could be spoken against by those who might otherwise remain silent. Her father, though not unkind, was a man who measured his words and weighed the character of others with care, and she knew that when the conversation came, it would not be a matter of romance but of practical assurances. Could this man provide a stable home? Would he bring no disgrace to the family name? Could he be relied upon to see to the welfare of any children born to the union? And so she busied herself in her own way, helping her mother with the tasks that demonstrated her readiness for the role she might soon be expected to fill. For in their time, a woman's skills in household management were regarded as a foundation for the household's survival. When the day finally came, it was not announced with any grand gesture, but rather took place on a cool evening when her father, having returned from inspecting the newly planted fields, stood outside the cottage sharpening the edge of a hoe, the sound carrying faintly into the road, and the young man approached with his cap in hand, greeting him with the respect due to both his age and his position, then stating plainly that he wished to discuss a matter of great importance. The conversation that followed was measured and deliberate. Each question from her father met with an answer that revealed not only his intentions but his understanding of the responsibilities that would follow. And though there was no immediate declaration, the older man's silence at the end carried a kind of consent, for in their world, a refusal would have been swift and absolute, and the absence of such rejection was itself a sign to be noted. In the weeks that followed, the discussion shifted from whether the match would take place to how it would be arranged for a betrothal in their village was not merely a private agreement but a public declaration witnessed by family and neighbors, often accompanied by a small feast and the symbolic joining of hands, sometimes bound together with a cord or ribbon in the practice known as handfasting, which, while not the same as a church wedding, was understood to carry binding force until the formal vows could be spoken before a priest. Her mother began the slow process of assembling the items that would form her portion of the household goods linens she had woven herself, a chest carved by her uncle, a set of wooden spoons and bowls, and perhaps, if the family could spare it, a small measure of silver coin that could serve as a modest dowry, not large enough to be sought for its own sake, but sufficient to honor the custom and provide a beginning to the new household. He, for his part, began to prepare the space that would become their home, repairing the roof of the small cottage near the mill that had once belonged to his uncle, mending the shutters, patching the wattle and door balls, and clearing the hearth so that it might be ready for the first fire they would light together after the wedding, for in their time, a man's ability to provide a secure dwelling was as important as the vows themselves. When the day of the betrothal came, the village green was once again the setting, though this time the gathering was smaller than the fair, consisting of both families and a handful of close neighbors. And at its center stood the two of them, their hands joined and bound together with a strip of cloth woven by her own hands, a gesture that carried both symbolic and practical meaning. For in a community where all knew one another's affairs, this was as much a declaration to the world as it was a promise to each other. The words spoken were not elaborate, for the church wedding would bring the full weight of blessing and formality, but they were clear and binding in their intent, and as the simple feast began, fresh bread, cheese, cider, and a roasted lamb provided by her father, the air was warm with the mingled voices of those who had seen them grow from children to adults, and who now looked upon them as a new household taking shape before their eyes, the rhythm of medieval life turning once more, as it always had, toward the joining of families and the building of futures. The morning of the wedding broke with a pale golden light that spread slowly over the village, touching the thatched roofs and misty fields, and while on most days the sounds of roosters and the clatter of pails at the well were all that marked the start of the day, this morning carried an unmistakable hum of anticipation. For a wedding was not merely a private affair but a community event that drew every villager, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest child, into its circle. In the small cottage where she still lived with her parents, preparations had begun before the sun had fully risen, her mother moving quietly but swiftly about the room, laying out the garments that had been carefully kept aside for this day. Her gown, though not new, had been freshly washed and pressed, its wool dyed a deep blue with woad, a color that signified both modesty and good fortune, and over it would be a simple linen veil to mark her as a bride, fastened with a narrow band embroidered in patterns her grandmother had once taught her. Elsewhere, in the cottage near the mill, he was already dressed in his best tunic, a sturdy garment of dark green wool with a leather belt polished to a soft sheen, his boots freshly cleaned, his hair combed and bound at the nape, for though his life was one of hard labor, today he was expected to present himself as the head of a new household, and he carried himself with a mix of pride and solemnity as he stepped outside to meet the small group of friends who would walk with him to the church. The church itself, a modest stone building with a bell that could be heard across the fields, had been swept clean the day before. Fresh rushes laid upon the floor, and on the altar stood candles and a small arrangement of greenery. Weddings in the medieval village were rarely lavish affairs, for wealth was scarce, but what they lacked in extravagance they made up for in sincerity and the strength of community bonds. And it was here that the priest, vested in his simple robes, waited to begin the rite. As tradition dictated, the couple did not arrive together. She came with her family, walking the short distance from her home surrounded by her mother, father, and siblings, while he approached from the opposite direction with his companions. The two groups meeting at the church door were the first part of the ceremony, known as the betrothal at the church porch, would take place, for in their time much of the marriage ritual happened in full view of the gathered community, with witnesses to hear the vows and ensure they were freely given. At the porch, the priest asked each in turn whether they came of their own free will, whether there were any lawful reasons they could not be wed, and whether they would take each other as husband and wife, to which they both answered in voices steady enough to be heard by those standing close, though the pounding of their hearts seemed loud enough to fill the morning air. Then, with the exchange of consent made, the priest led them into the church for the nuptial mass, where prayers were offered for their union and for the children they might one day have. For in the medieval view, marriage was both a sacred bond and the foundation of the family line. The mass itself was simple but solemn, the Latin words flowing over them as candles flickered in the still air. And when it was done, they emerged once more into the daylight, their hands joined, the bell ringing overhead to announce the union to the whole parish, its peals carrying far across the fields, where those too far to attend would still know that a wedding had taken place. What followed was the procession to the feast, and though their village was small, no wedding was without celebration. Long trestle tables had been set up in the green beside the common well, laden with trenchers of bread, wheels of cheese, roasted fowl and jugs of ale and cider, with neighbors contributing what they could, one family bringing honey cakes, another a basket of apples, while the miller had sent a sack of the finest flour for baking, and there was music provided by a fiddler and a piper whose tune set children to dancing before the meal was even served. The feast lasted long into the afternoon, with laughter, toasts, and the occasional playful teasing aimed at the new couple, for in the customs of the time, it was expected that friends would jest about the wedding night to come, though always under the watchful eye of elders who ensured that such banter did not stray too far. And as the shadows began to lengthen, there came the moment when the couple would leave for their home, escorted by a small group carrying candles or torches, for even this walk was part of the tradition, marking the passage from the public celebration to the private consummation of their vows. In some villages, the wedding night was a strangely public matter, with friends and family following the couple to their bedchamber, offering blessings, and even remaining in the room until the couple lay down together, a custom meant to ensure that the marriage was truly begun. But in their case, the custom was gentler, with only her mother and his closest friend entering the cottage to see that the hearth was lit, the bed prepared, and a cup of spiced wine left at the bedside before withdrawing, leaving them alone in the quiet warmth of their new home. As the door closed behind the last of their well-wishers, they stood together in the soft glow of the fire, the sounds of laughter and music still drifting faintly from the green. And though the day had been long and filled with ritual, there was a sense that their life was only now beginning. For in the medieval world, love might blossom before marriage or grow within it, but in either case, the bond was one that would shape the course of their days. From the first breaking of bread together as husband and wife to the many seasons of labor, joy, and hardship that lay ahead. The night after the feast in the great hall, when the torches in the castle yard had burned low, and the sentries on the battlements walked their slow rounds beneath a sky strewn with faint stars, you found yourself in a quiet alcove just beyond the chapel door, where the carved stone archway framed a narrow bench worn smooth by the years, and the air smelled faintly of wax and incense. And here Lady Alisonde had lingered as though waiting for someone, her hands folded before her and her head bowed so that the candlelight from the chapel fell like a halo across her hair, and as you approached she lifted her gaze with a soft half-smile that suggested she had been expecting you all along, and without speaking she gestured toward the bench, inviting you to sit beside her in the shadowed hush, where the only sound was the low murmur of prayers within and the distant bark of a hound somewhere in the outer yard. She began to speak not in the polished, courtly phrases you had grown accustomed to hearing from her in the presence of others, but in a quieter, almost conspiratorial tone, telling you that the feast had been pleasant enough, but that she preferred the moments between such grand displays. The moments when people spoke without the weight of ceremony upon them, and as she spoke her words wove into recollections of her own youth in the countryside, of watching the spring fairs arrive in the market town where merchants from far-off cities would set up their stalls hung with bolts of dyed cloth and trays of jewelry that caught the sunlight. And she told you how the young men and women of the surrounding villages would wander through the fair in their best tunics or gowns, casting glances at one another across the stalls and sometimes lingering by the musician's corner where a fiddler and a piper played tunes older than memory, and how these glances, smiles, and shared cups of spiced wine were often the beginnings of courtships that could last a lifetime or dissolve before the next harvest. She spoke of the peculiar customs that accompanied such meetings, of how a suitor might send a length of ribbon as a token to be worn at the sleeve, and how, during May Day dances, a young man might try to pluck a garland from the hair of the one he admired as a sign of his interest, while the young woman could choose to let him keep it or gently take it back, each gesture holding layers of meaning understood by all who watched. And as she described these rituals, you could almost hear the distant laughter of youths beneath budding trees, feel the warmth of a May sun, and smell the mingled scents of trampled grass and blooming hawthorn drifting through the air. The more she spoke, the more her voice seemed to wrap the two of you in a world apart from the stone walls around you. And she told you of troubadours who traveled from court to court carrying songs of lovers, both real and imagined, of secret meetings at the edge of meadows where whispered vows were spoken, and of the curious blend of formality and daring that defined medieval romance, how public gestures of admiration might be made under the eyes of the whole community, yet the true feelings of the heart were guarded closely and revealed only in rare moments of trust. From there she began to share the subtler rules, the ones unspoken yet known by all, that a man might show devotion by offering to carry water from the well for the lady's household, or by standing watch along the road while her kin were away, and that a woman might, without a word, offer encouragement by preparing a certain herb-infused bread, or tying her hair in a particular braid, each small act a message in a language without ink or parchment, a language of gestures and silences that bound people together in ways no law could dictate. She told you that while many such courtships ended in marriage, others were content to remain as they were in exchange of tokens, smiles, and songs that brightened the seasons without demanding more, and that in those days, when life was often brief and uncertain, the value of a moment was understood in ways you found difficult to imagine in your own time. And as she said this, she turned her gaze toward the narrow window above the chapel door, where the stars were faint against the darkness, but steady all the same, as if to remind you that some things hope, longing, companionship, were as constant as the turning of the heavens. When at last the bells within the chapel sounded the hour for Compline, and the voices of the monks swelled in a final hymn, Lady Alessandri rose, smoothing the folds of her gown, and she told you that tomorrow there would be another gathering in the hall, one less formal than the feast, but perhaps more telling of the ways in which this castle-less people lived and loved, and she invited you to walk with her then through the gardens where she promised. The flowers bloomed not only for beauty, but for messages known to those who understood their language, and with that she stepped into the chapel, leaving you seated on the worn bench, the echoes of her voice still warm in your mind, and the sense that you were being drawn ever deeper into the rhythms of medieval life, where every gesture could be a story, every word a promise, and every glance a thread in the intricate tapestry of human connection. The Lovers' Walk was not much to look at first glance, just a narrow stone-paved corridor, running along the inside of the curtain wall with a low roof of timber beams above it, open to the outer ward on one side, through a series of small arches. But as you walked its length with Lady Alessandri, you could see why it had earned its name, for the space felt sheltered and apart from the bustle of the castle's main court, with the sound of voices muffled by the thick walls and the cool air tinged faintly with the scent of the herbs that grew in the narrow beds just beyond the arches. And she told you that in her youth it had been the place where young couples might take the long way around the castle on some errand, moving slowly enough to allow for words to be exchanged that could not be spoken under the watchful eyes of elders. She described how on summer evenings, when the heat of the day had faded and the sky was painted in soft colors, the Lovers' Walk would become a ribbon of shadow where two figures might stroll side by side, hands brushing briefly without clasping, voices low and careful, and how sometimes they would stop at one of the arches to look out at the setting sun, using the moment to pass a token, a ribbon, a scrap of embroidered cloth, a sprig of rosemary, each item chosen for its meaning in the silent language of courtship, where rosemary meant remembrance and a red ribbon might mean courage or passion, depending on who gave it and how it was worn. Lady Alessandri said that such exchanges, small as they seemed, could weigh heavily on the heart, For to give a token was to risk much. If the affection was not returned, the object could be discarded or worse, shown to another as evidence of misplaced feelings, but that the boldest hearts often found such risk sweet, for it lent a thrill to the secrecy and a kind of poetry to the waiting. And she smiled faintly, as though remembering some old token of her own that had been carefully hidden away in a chest for decades. You walked on in silence for a time, letting the rhythm of your steps match hers, and she pointed out a section of the wall where the stone was worn smooth at shoulder height, a place where people often paused to rest their arms as they talked, and she told you that in the days when the Lord's household was larger, you could pass along this walk in the early evening and see 3 or 4 pairs of figures at different points, some laughing softly, others standing close with heads bent together, their words carried away by the wind before they could be overheard. And you imagined the scene as she spoke, filling the corridor with a faint echo of shoes on stone and the murmur of voices under the darkening sky. At the far end of the lovers' walk there was a small postern gate, a door in the wall just large enough for one person to pass through, leading to the outer gardens and orchards beyond. And Lady Alisande said that on feast days or during fairs in the nearby village, a trusted servant might be sent through with a message or to escort a lady to meet her kin. But that in truth the gate was sometimes used for far less official purposes, for if a pair could not meet within the castle, they might arrange to meet just beyond the gate, where the shade of the orchard offered privacy that even the lovers' walk could not. She told you of one such meeting she had overheard in her youth, when she had been sent to fetch a jug of water from the well near the orchard, and had stumbled upon a squire and a merchant's daughter speaking in hushed tones under the boughs, their words a mixture of promises and fears, for they were of different stations and knew their union would be forbidden, yet they clung to one another's hands, as though to let go would mean losing everything. And she had quietly walked away without making her presence known, knowing that to interrupt would be to break a moment that belonged wholly to them. When you stepped out through the postern gate now, the air was cooler, touched with the scent of damp earth and the last blossoms of the season, and the orchard stretched out in neat rows, the ground beneath the trees littered with fallen fruit that would be gathered for cider in the coming days. And Lady Alisande walked slowly between the trunks, speaking of how the orchard had long been a place where the rules of the hall seemed softer, where children played freely and young people might slip away from the watch of their elders, and how even in her later years she had sometimes come here to sit alone and watch the sunlight filter through the leaves, knowing that somewhere nearby there might be another pair quietly walking among the trees, weaving their own story. The light was beginning to fade now, and as you turned back toward the castle, you felt as though you had been shown not just a physical path, but a hidden map of medieval courtship itself, one traced in stolen glances, secret tokens, and the deliberate pacing of steps along a stone walk where love could bloom in the shadows without ever being seen in full daylight. And you understood that in this world the spaces between words were as important as the words themselves, for in them lay the hope, the risk, and the quiet beauty of love. When you re-entered the castle from the postern gate, the warmth of the inner ward felt almost overwhelming after the coolness of the orchard, and the fading light caught in the banners that hung along the gallery above the courtyard, each one heavy with embroidery that told a piece of the family's history, and Lady Alisande paused beneath them to explain that such banners were not only marks of honor but sometimes served as unspoken messages during festivities. For the placement of a banner or the choice to display a particular emblem could be a way of signaling to certain guests that they were welcome, or to others that a matter was to be discussed in private, and in the realm of courtship this could extend to subtler meanings still, such as the discreet invitation to dance or to share a word away from prying ears. She led you next toward the great hall, where the long tables had been cleared after the midday meal, and the floor swept clean of rushes so that the servants could scatter fresh herbs for the evening's gathering, the scent of lavender and sweet woodruff rising from the floor as you stepped inside. And she told you that the great hall was both the most public and the most dangerous place for those caught up in the games of love, For here every word might be overheard, every glance noticed, and yet it was also where opportunity was richest, for in the noisy warmth of a feast, one could pass a cup from hand to hand, letting fingers brush longer than necessary, or send a message in the form of a dish specially chosen for its symbolism: cherries for sweetness, pears for enduring affection, almonds for hope of union. She described the subtlety with which a hopeful suitor might seat himself or herself, perhaps 2 places away from the intended, allowing the ebb and flow of the meal to bring them together naturally, and how the choice of who sat where was sometimes less a matter of formal rank and more the quiet handiwork of a sympathetic hostess who understood the delicate work of bringing 2 people into closer orbit without causing gossip to flare too brightly. For, in such matters, a hint was far better than a shout. At one end of the hall the minstrels' gallery stood empty now, but Lady Alessandri spoke of how during feast nights the music would drift down like a soft net, catching the thoughts of those below and drawing them into the rhythm of the dancers. For in the medieval world, the dance floor was one of the rare places where men and women could move together with some freedom, their steps bringing them close and then parting them again, a pattern that allowed for fleeting contact under the guise of formality. And how a particularly daring glance exchanged mid-turn could be enough to set a heart racing for days. She recalled one such dance from her youth, when the firelight had turned the hall into a shifting tapestry of gold and shadow, and the young knight she had secretly admired had taken her hand for the opening measure, his touch firm yet respectful, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment before they moved apart, and she said she remembered almost nothing of the music or the steps that followed. Only the way her pulse had quickened in that instant, and the knowledge that he must have felt it too. For his hand had lingered by the slightest degree when they met again in the pattern, moving from the hall into the smaller withdrawing chamber beyond. Lady Alessandri explained that such spaces were the true heart of medieval matchmaking, for while the great hall gave the first spark, the withdrawing chamber provided the tinder, allowing a smaller group to talk more freely under the watch of only a few attendants. And here the low fire, the cushioned benches, and the quiet crackle of the logs created a mood in which words could be chosen more carefully, each one carrying weight, each silence filled with unspoken understanding. She pointed to the far corner where a tall carved chair stood, its high back shielding the occupant from view on one side, and she said this was where the shrewdest matches were made, for one could sit there and speak with another without being fully visible to the rest of the room. And in this partial concealment, a simple conversation about weather or trade could become, in tone and glance, an entirely different exchange, one in which affection, curiosity, or even longing might pass without ever being named aloud. By the time you returned to the gallery above the courtyard, the last light was fading from the sky, and the castle lamps were being lit one by one, each small flame marking the transition from day's work to evening's softer hours. And you realized that, in this world, courtship was not a single act, but a slow weaving together of many small threads, tokens exchanged, glances held, dances shared, words spoken in sheltered corners, and that each thread mattered because, once woven, they could form something strong enough to hold against the weight of time, even if the world outside the castle changed entirely. As you followed Lady Alessandri down the narrow spiral stair toward the ground floor, the stones cooled beneath your palm and the faint smell of wax from the torches ahead, mixing with the damp scent of the inner walls. She explained that for all the careful dances and glances within the great hall, many of the most decisive moments in medieval courtship happened in places less grand, in corridors between chambers, at the edges of kitchens, or even in the quiet spaces of the chapel cloister where the air felt heavy with stillness. For there the noise of the world seemed far away, and a whispered word could carry more meaning than a declaration made in front of dozens. She led you into the cloister itself, its square of grass silvered by the moonlight and bordered by the covered walkway whose columns cast alternating bands of shadow and light. And she told you that lovers often found themselves drawn here not by chance but by design. For a well-timed walk after supper could bring 2 people into the same quiet stretch where their steps slowed naturally. Their voices dropped without thinking, and the conversation might turn to more personal things under the safety of the night air. With the carved saints and angels overhead bearing silent witness, At the far corner, a bench worn smooth by centuries of use sat against the wall, and she traced her fingers along its edge, saying that she had sat here many times in her youth with companions, sometimes speaking of books or poetry, sometimes merely watching the moon rise over the cloister garden, and that while no hand was ever held openly there, the shared stillness itself was its own kind of closeness, a quiet pact of understanding that needed no touch to be felt. From the cloister you crossed into the chapel, its cool interior lit only by the flicker of votive candles before the altar, and Lady Alisonde's voice grew softer as she explained that the chapel was perhaps the most complex space for courtship in the medieval world, for it was sacred ground and any overt display would have been unthinkable. Yet it was also a place where hearts were laid bare in prayer, and where a suitor might kneel a little closer than strictly necessary, or choose the same hour to pray, so that the two would rise together and leave side by side in a silence that carried a quiet charge between them. She recalled the story of a young scribe and a lady-in-waiting who had never dared to speak beyond the most formal words, yet who for months would find themselves in the chapel at the same time, their prayers offered in parallel. And when at last he left for another lord's household, he placed a folded scrap of parchment in the hymn book she used, not with a love poem or confession, but with a single line from a psalm that both of them knew well its meaning for them alone, hidden from the world yet clear as sunlight to their own hearts. You walked then to the outer bailey, where the air was cooler and the sound of the watchman's footsteps echoed along the war-walk above, and she explained that while much of courtship was a weaving of glances and tokens, there were times when a bold gesture was needed, something that might risk reputation, yet prove devotion, such as a knight arriving in the dead of night to leave a carved emblem or a piece of his armor at a lady's door, or a maiden daring to send a ribbon embroidered with her own hand to be worn on a sleeve during a tournament. The moonlight touched the drawbridge where it crossed the shallow moat, and Lady Alisonde said that bridges, too, were places of significance in medieval love, for they marked the boundary between the protected space of the castle and the world beyond, and more than one farewell or promise had been spoken at such a threshold, where the knowledge of separation lent weight to every word, and the creak of the timbers beneath their feet would be remembered for years afterward. As you turned back toward the warmth of the castle, she told you that in truth, medieval dating, or what might be called dating now, was not a single act or an event, but a careful, patient art of building trust in small increments, in shared moments scattered across months or even years, and that while the modern world often thought of romance as sudden, in those days it was more often a slow fire, tended and fed until it burned bright enough to be acknowledged openly, or else remained forever a quiet ember in two hearts, carried with them wherever they went. When you and Lady Alisonde stepped back into the great hall, the fire on the hearth had burned down to a bed of red coals that glowed softly in the dimness, and she told you that late-night gatherings by the embers were sometimes the most telling part of a medieval evening, for with the clamor of the day gone and the formality loosened, people would speak more freely, sharing songs, riddles, or tales that might hold hidden messages for a particular listener. A playful line slipped into a story, or a lyric chosen for its unspoken significance. She gestured toward the long benches where a handful of courtiers still sat, their cloaks wrapped close against the draught, and said that in such moments, a man might position himself so his shadow stretched toward the lady he admired, or a woman might set her cup down where another's hand would be sure to brush it when reaching for wine. These small, almost accidental contacts carrying far more meaning than they appeared to on the surface. Moving to a side table, she picked up a lute that rested there, its polished wood gleaming in the firelight, and explained that music was another courtship language entirely in the medieval world. For a troubadour's song could veil private longing within chivalric verses, and an audience might believe it addressed to some faraway noblewoman when, in truth, the singer's eyes never strayed from a single person listening at the edge of the crowd. She told you of one such song composed during a winter feast, when a visiting knight from Aquitaine sang of the Lady of the Silver Candle, and everyone assumed he meant a duchess known for her beauty. But in truth, the silver candle referred to the way the torchlight caught in the hair of the steward's daughter, a fact known only to the two of them, turning the performance into a secret exchange in plain sight. The scent of spiced wine drifted from the kitchens, and Lady Alisande led you toward it, remarking that, in medieval life, the sharing of food and drink was itself part of the dance of affection. For offering a favored morsel from one's own plate or ensuring a cup was refilled could speak of care and regard without a single word, especially in public settings where a more direct approach might have been considered improper. As you passed through the arched doorway into the smaller service hall, she recalled how, during the harvest feast, a young page had carried an extra honeyed fig across the room to place it on the trencher of a girl who had been too shy to approach him earlier, and that act, though tiny, was remembered for years by those who had noticed, for in the medieval mind, it was not only the grand gestures, but the gentle ones that defined true interest. She opened a narrow door at the back of the hall, and you stepped into a stone passage lit by a single oil lamp, the air cool and faintly damp, and she explained that private messages sometimes traveled these ways, sent through trusted intermediaries such as servants, squires, or even children, whose movements aroused less suspicion. The folded parchment or knotted token tucked inside a pouch or hidden beneath bread in a basket. Reaching the far end of the passage, she pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a small courtyard where the night sky was clear and the stars shone bright over the high walls, and she said that the sight of the heavens often inspired lovers to exchange promises, for the belief that stars bore witness to oaths was common, and to stand together beneath them was to seal a moment in memory as surely as if it had been written in ink. You stood beside her in the courtyard as she spoke of one final truth, that while medieval dating was framed by rules, expectations, and the watchful eyes of others, it was at heart a deeply human pursuit, filled with the same quiet hopes and fears as any age, and that every stolen glance, every coded word, every shared silence was part of a timeless story in which people have always sought not just to be seen, but to be understood. The courtyard air was cool enough to make you pull your cloak tighter, and Lady Alisande noticed, offering to walk with you back toward the warmth of the great hall, yet she did so slowly, as if neither of you wished to break the spell of the quiet night. Her steps soft over the worn flagstones while the faint sound of distant laughter carried from within. As you crossed beneath the shadow of a tall tower, she told you that many medieval courtships reached a moment much like this, when the games of wit, the coded gestures, and the subtle exchanges had been played out enough to draw two hearts closer, and now came the question of whether to speak more plainly. For once words were truly spoken, there was no returning to the unknowing. She spoke of how in the courtly romances, beloved by her peers, the turning point was often not a kiss or an embrace, but a quiet conversation in a half-lit place, when one person at last named their feelings and the other, with a look or a word, confirmed that the dance they had shared was indeed a mutual one. You passed under an arched doorway and into a smaller chamber lined with tapestries that told the tale of Tristan and Isolde, their faces frozen in eternal longing across the woven panels, and Lady Alisande traced a fingertip along the edge of the cloth, saying that such stories were warnings as much as inspirations for love could lift or undo depending on the choices made once it was acknowledged. In the dimness, she told you of a lady she once knew who had been courted by a knight from a distant county, their exchanges all through letters passed by servants, and when at last he spoke his heart in person, she found her own feelings matched his, yet their houses were at odds, and though they pledged themselves in secret, their lives from then on were shaped by the burden of that choice. You realized that her stories, while clothed in the finery of history, held a certain personal weight, and perhaps her telling of them to you tonight was its own form of signaling, not unlike the coded gifts and phrases she had described, though whether she meant them as mere lessons or as something more you could not yet say. She led you to a bench by a narrow window where moonlight pooled on the stone, and together you sat listening to the night, the silence between you comfortable yet edged with an awareness that the evening was drawing toward. It closed the way a song slows before its last notes. Lady Alisande looked out toward the sleeping courtyard and said that medieval life was a series of departures and returns, for the turning of the seasons, the call to war, the demands of land and lord often pulled people apart just as they had begun to draw near, making every meeting both a joy and a risk. She told you that perhaps this was why their expressions of love were so carefully woven into daily life, because they could not know when they might be parted. Each glance, each shared moment of laughter, each quiet walk under the stars becoming a memory to carry through uncertain days. When at last she rose from the bench, her movement was unhurried, and she offered you her hand not as a gesture of ceremony, but as something warmer, something that lingered, and without words, you both knew you were nearing the end of this shared chapter, yet you also knew that the story of love in the medieval world, like love itself, never truly ended, but only moved on to its next telling. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the high windows of the hall, touching the wooden tables and scattering gold over the flagstone floor, and you found yourself walking once more through the familiar corridors, each step echoing in a space that now seemed changed, not because the stones had shifted, but because of the hours you had lived within them. Lady Alisande greeted you with a smile that carried both warmth and a quiet farewell, for, in the medieval way, partings were never made heavy with sadness, but rather woven into the fabric of life, like the turning of a page in a book that had many more to come, each chapter building on the last. You shared a final cup of spiced wine together, the scent of cinnamon and cloves rising in the cool morning air, and she spoke of how every courtship, whether in her time or in yours, was a dance between hope and patience, a balance of gestures seen and unseen, and that while fashions might change and customs might fade, the human heart moved to much the same rhythm across the centuries. Outside, the village was already awake, market stalls being set, chickens pecking in the dust, and you realized that all around you were 1,000 small stories of connection, some just beginning, some long past their first spark, yet all part of the same great tapestry of human longing and companionship. She walked with you to the outer gate, where the path led down toward the road you had first arrived by, and as the guards lifted the heavy oak beam to let you through, you looked back to see her still there, framed in the archway, her cloak stirred by the breeze. And though no words passed between you, the look in her eyes was enough to tell you that your time together would live on in memory. The road ahead stretched out beneath the wide, pale sky, and you followed it with the calm knowledge that while this chapter had closed, the echoes of what you had learned, the glances, the laughter, the quiet moonlit bench would remain, ready to rise again in some future moment when the heart called for them. And so as the village faded behind you, the medieval world seemed to fold gently away, leaving you with the quiet certainty that love in all its forms was never bound to a single age, but moved, with us, carried in stories, in gestures, and in the way we choose to meet each other across time. If you enjoyed this gentle journey through history and the heart, remember to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story. Give this video a like to help others discover it. Share it with anyone who loves history told in a calm and soothing way. And leave a comment below with your thoughts or the moments that stood out most to you. And when you're ready for more, I invite you to watch the previous videos in this series. One a quiet door into another time, another place, and another story waiting to be told. Good night, dear listener. The following morning arrived beneath a pale sky streaked with threads of rose and gold, and as the castle slowly stirred to life with the sound of buckets clattering in the courtyard and the low murmur of servants tending to their morning duties, you found Lady Alisande already waiting near the herb garden, her cloak drawn lightly around her shoulders to keep off the lingering chill, and when she saw you, she greeted you with a nod that carried both familiarity and a quiet expectation, as if the conversation from the night before had merely paused rather than ended. And together you stepped through the low archway into the garden, where stone paths wound between raised beds of green and silver leaves, each plant set in its place according to purpose and tradition. She walked slowly, letting her fingers trail over the tops of rosemary bushes whose scent rose with each touch, and she told you that, in her youth, she had been taught the language of flowers by her grandmother, a language older than the castle itself, in which each bloom or sprig carried meaning. For desire, violet; for loyalty, marigold; for sorrow, time; for courage, and that, in the days before ink and parchment were common to all, this was how many chose to speak the words they could not risk writing or saying aloud. A silent courtship conducted through carefully chosen bouquets left on doorsteps or tucked into the straps of a saddle. As she bent to show you the small white blossoms of meadowsweet, She explained that this flower could mean joy in marriage or a wish for peace between quarreling parties, and that a suitor might bring it to a meeting in hopes of softening a lady's hesitation, while sprigs of rue could signal regret or repentance, offered by someone seeking forgiveness. And you realized how much care and subtlety went into these seemingly simple exchanges, how an entire conversation could be carried in the fold of a cloth or the curve of a ribbon binding the stems. The garden itself seemed to hum with quiet stories. There were old rose bushes whose roots had been in this soil for decades, perhaps planted to honor some long-forgotten union, lavender hedges that had once scented the garments of brides, and tall foxgloves that, while beautiful, were known for their dangerous nature and thus sometimes included in secret warnings disguised as gifts. For even romance in medieval times was not without its undercurrents of caution and intrigue. Lady Alisande spoke too of how such gifts were received, how a woman might keep a sprig of mint in her sleeve if she wished to let the suitor know she welcomed his attention, or might return the flowers with a twist of grass to signal polite refusal, all done with grace, so that even rejection became part of the dance. And she smiled faintly as she recalled certain tales from the castle's past in which misunderstandings of floral meaning had led to humorous or dramatic outcomes, like the knight who sent a bouquet of yellow roses, thinking they meant friendship only to find they were taken as a sign of jealousy, or the young woman who sent rue in jest and found herself having to explain to a confused admirer that she was not in mourning for their courtship after all. She led you then to a bench beneath an arch of climbing roses, where bees moved lazily among the petals, and here she told you of the midday gatherings that took place in the gardens on market days, when merchants from the nearby town were allowed to enter the castle grounds for trading and news, and when young men and women both noble and common would mingle more freely than usual under the pretense of buying herbs or sampling honey, though many came only to exchange a glance, a word, or a token. And it struck you how such brief meetings could be the highlight of a week, cherished and remembered long after the baskets had been emptied and the market stalls taken down. Her words painted a picture of courtship as a tapestry woven from countless small acts, a smile over a shared task at the well, a note hidden in the binding of a prayer book, a hand brushed lightly in passing while walking the garden paths, and as she spoke you began to understand how the very structure of daily life in the medieval world seemed designed to create these fleeting but meaningful connections, the balance of duty and longing of public decorum and private hope. When at last the castle bell tolled for the midday meal, Lady Alisande rose, brushing a fallen rose petal from her cloak, and told you that after the meal you should meet her in the hall where the minstrels sometimes played for the assembled household. For music, she said, was as much a part of courtship as flowers or feasts, and perhaps more so, for a song could travel where words could be heard in the corners of a hall, or in the stillness of a night's watch, and could lodge itself in the memory of the one for whom it was meant, until long after the voice that sang it had fallen silent. With that she walked with you toward the great hall, the scent of the garden still clinging to your sleeves, and you felt the curious pull of this world. She was showing you its intricate codes, its quiet daring, its beauty rooted in patience, and you knew that whatever lay ahead in the hall would only deepen your sense of how love and life were intertwined in the medieval heart. The great hall was already alive with the murmured sounds of voices, the clatter of trenchers being set upon long wooden tables, and the faint strains of a lute being tuned somewhere near the dais. And as you entered beside Lady Alisande, the warmth from the central hearth washed over you, mingling with the rich aromas of roasted fowl, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread that drifted through the air like an invitation. And you could feel how the room's energy shifted subtly when music began to weave its way between conversations, soft at first, almost like a whisper, until the notes grew steady and sure, filling the high raftered space. A pair of minstrels stood near the hearth, one with a lute, and the other with a small harp, and their eyes scanned the room not just for appreciation but for recognition. Because in the medieval hall music was not merely entertainment, it was often a coded message, a thread of meaning that might be intended for one person alone, even if it was sung before 100. And Lady Alisande leaned close to tell you that certain songs, old ballads and courtly airs, was so well known that a single line might stir a memory or declare an intention, a subtle courtship spoken in melody where plain words might be forbidden. She told you of a knight who once commissioned a song to be played at a feast, its verses praising a lady's virtue under the guise of describing a falcon in flight, and how the lady seated across the hall understood the metaphor, instantly replying days later by having her maid wear a brooch shaped like a falcon when passing through the market, and you began to see how layered and deliberate these exchanges could be, requiring both patience and a shared knowledge of symbols that made the courtship feel like a private game played in plain sight. The minstrels now began a lively tune about a May Day festival, and you watched as some of the younger men and women in the hall smiled at each other over their trenchers, a playful rhythm allowing for glances and small gestures that could pass unnoticed by elders too engaged in their own talk, while at the high table the steward poured Lady Alessandri a cup of mulled wine and asked politely if she might request a song, to which she answered with a name you did not recognize, but which made the minstrels nod knowingly before they shifted into a gentler melody, its notes slow and lingering like footsteps along a garden path in twilight. Lady Alessandri explained in a low voice that this was a song of waiting, one often sung by those whose beloved was far away, perhaps at war, perhaps in another household, and that for those listening who knew its meaning, it could be both a comfort and a quiet plea, reminding the absent one that they were remembered. And you thought about how many in the hall might be hearing this with a particular person in mind, holding the music like a secret between heartbeats. As the final notes faded, the conversation in the hall seemed softer, touched by the mood of the song, and Lady Alessandri used the moment to speak of the role of feasts and gatherings in medieval courtship not merely as opportunities for public display but as carefully staged events where alliances could be hinted at, promises implied, and the slow weaving of bonds carried on beneath the surface of bread breaking and toasts. And she described how even the seating arrangements could be a signal for it to be placed beside someone at table, or within easy conversation across the board, might be a sign that their company was favored or their match being quietly considered. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, now catching the motes of dust that drifted lazily above the tables, and as the meal came to a close, the minstrels began a final cheerful tune to see the guests off to their tasks, the younger men lingering just long enough to offer to carry platters or refill jugs for the ladies. Small acts that, though practical, were also part of the courtship dance. Each gesture noted, each smile remembered. When the hall began to empty, Lady Alessandri suggested you walk with her to the outer ward, where she wished to show you something she called the Lover's Walk, a narrow covered passage along the castle wall where, in her youth, she had seen more than one shy exchange of words between those who could not meet elsewhere. And as you followed her out into the crisp air, you realized that she was drawing you ever deeper into the private spaces, and unspoken customs that made love in the medieval world not just an affair of the heart, but a careful art shaped by patience, cleverness, and the constant dance between duty and desire.